So I'm just going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves. And I'll start. I'm Justin Lee. I'm Associate Editor at First Things. And I've been here for a year and a half. And excited to go through, I think, some pretty good questions that will hopefully be useful to a lot of people in the room. So we'll start with Matthew.
Yeah, first, thanks all for coming. Thank you, Justin, for moderating this panel, and thanks to Rusty and to the staff at First Things, especially Claire Gentini and Vicki Clark for this. Really grateful. My name is Matthew Schmitz. I'm an editor and founder of Compact, an online magazine. My colleague Stephen Adebato is in the crowd. Great to have you here, Stephen. As Stephen knows, and I'd love for the rest of you to find Compact is kind of new magazine, brings together people from the left and the right. Before that, I worked for a dozen years at First Things. Part of that time in this office, so it feels great to be back.
Yeah, I'm Daniel McCarthy. I am the Vice President for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Currently, I also edit a quarterly journal called Modern Age, copies of which are available on the back table. And I got started in journalism about 20 years ago. I went to work for the American Conservative magazine when it was newly founded, about 1 year after it had begun. I eventually became the editor-in-chief there around 2010 to 2016. And I've written for a number of outlets, including First Things. I am a regular contributor to the New York Post, of which we have many representatives here tonight. And I've also written for some of the sort of less reputable New York media, New York Times, and certain other things. So, and hopefully, I have experiences going back sort of to my college days. I currently run the Collegiate Network for ISI, but I'm proud to say that back in the 1990s and early part of the 2000s, I was a student who was a recipient of the Collegiate Network support. And so the Collegiate Network is a network of about 80 papers across the country, conservative-leaning or at least non-leftist, and ISI helps to provide them financial support, organizational support, but very little actual guidance or hands-on direction. All of these papers are self-directed. They are sort of run by students themselves. But they are an opportunity for students to get experience with journalism on the campus level, and then perhaps to follow in my footsteps and carry on that experience with journalism into their professional lives.
Hi, I'm Caroline Downey. I'm a reporter at National Review. I cover education, gender, and generally culture war topics. I'm also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Conservator, which is a digital magazine covering fashion and lifestyle for women. So that's kind of the thing I do on the side, but National Review is my main gig, and I'm very grateful for the generous invitation to be here.
All right. Well, thank you all. So first question, which is not as stupid as it sounds. What even is journalism? Especially what is journalism versus reportage? Is it something that is a grander endeavor? If so, why? How?
Well, Caroline, you're reporting now, yes?
Yes.
So perhaps
Yes.
a good...
All the tough questions.
Sure, yeah. And I would like to preface this by pleading some naivete, just because I am more junior than these gentlemen here.
You're actually doing the work, whereas we're,
That's true. I'm in the trenches,
we're
so
editing,
to speak.
which is the easy part.
Yes. And this is a very interesting question because it speaks to how journalism has evolved over the decades, whether it is even the same pursuit it once was. And I also just got finished with the Logos Fellowship, stewarded by Christopher Rufo, which is a very interesting figure that was done with the blessing of the Manhattan Institute, which is a very reputable, established institution. But Chris Rufo is very much revolutionizing journalism as it was traditionally understood. And I think the question was, what is it? So I think it's more of an intellectual project, and I think today, how I understand it, especially having just done this fellowship, is that it's not merely just uncovering truth or exposing facts. It's there is a purpose to journalism. I think it used to be historically that maybe it was more shouting into the void or generating even outrage for outrage's sake, basically stimulating anger. And there's, names you could name, some, certain media empires that have made this their practice. And what I learned really in the last couple of weeks is that that's kind of like an empty, there's something almost unethical about that, because you're giving, let's talk about a cable news network. Say it's an audience, and they're predominantly boomers. You're giving them dopamine hits every single night that they're addicted to the anger and the rush of hearing, their blood pressure skyrockets every night for no reason. And they have nowhere to channel that energy into, because no one is giving them a solution. They're giving them a set of problems and, like I said, outrages, but there's no goal in mind. There's no objective. And so I think now what I see journalism as is, you're supposed to be looking or finding the scandals, articulating them to the public, not just in kind of robotic, plainly, objectivity matters because accuracy matters, but the classic old phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, is, I don't think that's true. I think they do. I think emotion is essential to communicating with people, because that's complementary to just information. And so rhetoric actually does matter in journalism. The way you convey your findings matters. Storytelling matters. And that's not me being a biased journalist who doesn't care about objectivity. That's me recognizing that this is how it's actually practiced, on the ground. This is how journalism is done, and our foes in left-wing media know this because they've been doing this well for years. They know exactly what gets people motivated and to mobilize. And so we have to play that game. We have to use rhetoric, and we have to have a purpose in mind. We have to have an end game, things that we want to achieve. We want to exert pressure on the relevant actors, if there is really a scandal. So anyway, that was kind of long-winded, but that's what I think journalism is.
So let's develop that a little bit. Dan, what would you say the proper telos of journalism is?
Well, I would begin by talking a little bit about the historical development of journalism, and I think it has mutated away from its original telos and its original function. So I promise this is not a sales pitch, but my colleague, in fact my boss, Johnny Burtka at ISI, has just brought out this book called Gateway to Statesmanship. And it's a collection of texts, classic texts of advice to kings, basically, and advice to rulers. So you have Xenophon, you have Machiavelli, you have St. Thomas More, a number of others compiled in this book. And for centuries, in fact for millennia, the idea was that if you wanted to have a just polity, or even a secure polity in the case of Machiavelli, you would need to have a ruler who was willing to listen to wise advice. Wise advice being factual, but also interpretive. And interpretive in the sense not only of how to apply the right principles to differing sets of circumstances, but also what those principles should be, the moral principles as well as the practical considerations of rulership. It seems to me that journalism is, this genre that I mentioned earlier is called the mirror for princes. Journalism is the mirror for peoples. And historically, it begins as information, factual information, for persons who have some degree of capacity to act in their own names and in their own contexts. In particular, you had merchants in the early modern era who needed to have information about what goods were coming into ports. They needed to have information about wars that were taking place in foreign lands. And the beginnings of newspapers, the beginnings of magazines, much of what we would recognize today as journalism, starts with reports that are generated in port cities and circulated among these merchants. But it doesn't stop there. It then goes beyond the merchants to their customers. It starts to be a product that is popular in coffee houses, which, by the way, today a coffee house may seem like a sort of genteel setting, but coffee houses were, these were people addicted to caffeine. They were wired. It was, this was early modern Europe, where, sedition is, almost any utterance could perhaps be potentially seditious. So there's a connection between democracy and this sort of rise of popular power and the rise of a media. But that's not where it ends, because there's also this need, which then develops one of the great publications that's still around today. It's not a direct descendant of, but it's in the spirit of its original name, a publication called The Spectator, which the current British edition dates to the 19th century. The original version of the magazine dated to the 18th century. But The Spectator actually began with a moral mission. And that moral mission was, among all of these rowdy merchants, among these, sort of quasi-democratic or people who are engaged in public affairs, or at least talking about public affairs in the coffee houses, if they're all just looking out for self-interest, they're all just looking out to make, whatever profit they can on the products coming to market, that would be a very shabby kind of society. That in fact what's needed is to elevate the morals of a rising bourgeoisie, a rising democratic and merchant class. So journalists such as Joseph Addison, for example, one of the founders of the Spectator, they had a moral mission, and they saw reporting on manners and on how to be a civilized human being as a key component of journalism. So I would just say in conclusion that reporting, yes, that's always been an element in terms of covering the wars that are taking place around the world, in terms of reporting economic news, but also opinion, interpretation of the facts, interpretation of the news has always been part of journalism. And then finally, there is also this moral component. And I think that moral component has largely either been abandoned or perverted by people who would like to, institute a new revolutionary morality. And in that sense, the highest, sort of telos of journalism is to take not just the facts and their interpretations, but also their moral significance into consideration.
Yeah. So there is definitely a pro-civic mandate to journalism. That looks a particular way in a republic. Matthew, what do you think the most, name one of, to your mind, one of the most significant recent pieces of journalism that is actually working effectively and with integrity towards a proper end for the republic?
So that's a great question. I can't think of a comprehensively admirable piece of journalism. I'll just kind of go back to I journalism myself, but I can't think of an ideal example. I'll just say one thing. I think Caroline talked about journalism's informing function, and Dan also talked about its edifying function, and I think it also has a function which is to amuse or divert. That's very classically a part of it. Like there should be some kind of there's often in reporting on the kind of absurd, on the absurd or the quaint, or the striking. Could be the lurid. So that's another element of journalism. In terms of journalism that's working well right now, I think it seems that the morning newsletter from the New York Times is quite successful. David Leonhardt's newsletter, Yale just announced it's bringing back standardized testing. David Leonhardt has been championing standardized testing in that newsletter, so he's having an effect. There are lots of other journalists elsewhere that are having a good effect, but I think he's kind of effectively doing some things right now in that newsletter.
Great. So next question. Do you consider Chris Rufo a journalist?
We haven't yet managed to impose kind of training requirements and certification requirements on journalists in America. Those exist in other countries. To be a journalist, you have to go through a course of education and get your certificate. Yes, he's absolutely a journalist. He has that muckraking component. He also does longer essays that that don't have that kind of direct appeal. So I guess that would be 1 vote out of 3 for yes.
No, I'd agree as well. And also, I wanted to answer perhaps the last question as well, in terms of what excellent journalism has been produced in recent years. And I think both Matthew and his wife, who works for First Things, they have done some really remarkable work in recent years. I'll single out Matthew in particular for an instance that happened about 3 or 4 years ago. You may recall that there was sudden news that broke on Twitter and the internet about a number of young Catholic students from Covington Catholic Academy, I think in Kentucky, who had supposedly mocked and derided an American Indian. This American Indian had been on the periphery of the March for Life. He wasn't a supporter of the unborn himself, but he was just happened to be there supposedly. And these horrible young children, these Catholic kids with their MAGA hats, they had done the tomahawk chop, and they had just pestered this old man and almost brought him to tears. And this was a disgraceful thing. When this story broke on the internet, it was very interesting to watch the reaction of journalists at many institutions, not just the progressive ones and the mainstream ones you might expect, but also, and I won't name any names, it would be undiplomatic, but even at a few conservative outlets, there were editors who immediately decided, okay, we accept these facts that we've just learned about these Covington Catholic young boys, and we want to have this moral function of journalism by denouncing the racism of these kids, denouncing their politics. Unfortunately for all of the people doing the denouncing, their facts were wrong. And one of the first people to uncover the truth and show that the facts that they had were wrong was Matthew Schmitz. Now, this was a few years ago, and many of the folks here are quite young. You may not remember how this actually happened on the day itself. But at the time, even if you worked for a conservative institution, if you wanted to defend these Covington Catholic kids who were seen as being absolutely just the embodiment of vile racism and disrespect and everything bad about Trumpism, or everything that's accused that Trumpism is accused of, it was very, very difficult. You were fighting uphill against an ideological sort of uniformity, and it takes tremendous courage to be able to sort of fight against that. And I had a couple of tweets defending the kids, but I hadn't found the facts myself yet. And Matthew did find them. He found, so there had been a video clip supposedly showing these kids, mocking an Indian. But in fact, Matthew, had found on the internet that there was a much longer clip, which actually showed that a group called the Black Hebrew Israelites, who, they are black, but they're not Hebrew or Israelite, although they see themselves as being the true Israelites. They really hate Jews. They're quite virulently anti-Semitic, but they're known for being very aggressive. They will do everything up to the limit of the law to confront, for example, pro-life students at the March for Life and just harass them and harangue them. So first of all, these, Black Hebrew Israelites have been doing this in the lead up to the part of the video that then went viral and got the Covington Catholic kids in trouble. The Indian was in fact also a left-wing agitator who had a whole career of attacking the Catholic Church and doing a number of other things. So he too was not just an innocent bystander. And it turned out that the Catholic kids, they had not been instigating anything. They had been trying to, and the reason they were smirking and smiling is because they were in a very high-pressure environment. They were very nervous. They had no idea what was going to happen to them. So Matthew was very brave, and he spoke the truth at a time when even in conservative media that was extremely unpopular, and he was vindicated for that because now, of course, not only did the truth come out and people learned the Covington Catholic kids were not guilty of what these really flawed journalists had accused them of, but some of these flawed journalists have had to pay significant settlements to the Catholic kids that they libeled. So CNN, I know, has had to make a payout. And I think there have been a number of others as well.
Yeah, I'll try to answer. No, that was terrific. I'll try to answer both of the last two questions, maybe combined. Yes, I believe Chris Rufo is a journalist, but he's a journalist, as I said, in the way it's actually practiced, like the real politique of journalism. And I would distinguish him also from someone like James O'Keefe, who identified more as a guerrilla journalist, and from what I understood from the past, engaged in maybe some unethical journalistic practices that Chris Rufo doesn't do.
He's a professional catfish.
Yeah.
It's okay, we can say it.
Yeah, professional catfish, right. Rufo verifies his sources. He triple checks things. Like, you cannot catch him in an inaccuracy because it's unbelievable just how careful he is. So he's not interested in, reporting things that are factually untrue. That being said, he does use rhetoric because he understands that it's powerful and it's potent, like for speaking to people, and left-wing outlets, they're very tactful at using that. And to answer the other question about an example of a reported story that was directed at a moral end, I would say undermining the credibility of the DEI regime in America's most prestigious universities, like the Ivy Leagues, was certainly a moral end. And Rufo's reporting alongside Aaron Sibarium's at the Washington Free Beacon and Chris Brunett's with the Substack / American Conservative, that combined it exposed something that is true, that the president of supposedly America's premier university, the largest endowment ever, like I'm pretty sure out of any college, and had been immune from criticism and had not risked really any donor withdrawal because it was almost like this invincible force in academia, Harvard University. They found that the president, who's, again, like shepherding this, is actually not adhering to academic standards in the most basic way. And then there was a cover-up by the Harvard Corporation to excuse it, and that's, the governing body of Harvard, basically saying, like, doubling down on diversity as the greatest strength of the American universities. Like, the founders, talk about them rolling in their graves. This is not only meritocracy, this is not what the university was founded for, Veritas. Just for them to die on this hill at whatever cost, it was unbelievable. And I think the number of plagiarism allegations that surfaced and the number that they corroborated, and with, again, like, just crazy detail, and they knew that this was accurate, and they waited for the right time to release it, and then the dominoes began to fall, and then she fell, and that was major. And I'm not pretending that DEI is dead now. It's not. Of course it's not, but that was difficult to pull that off.
Ackman might kill it though.
Huh?
Bill Ackman might kill it.
Yes, and I think old school liberals like Bill Ackman saw the light of day as a consequence of both October 7th, but then again, like, kids at Harvard would be expelled for the offenses that Claudine Gay committed. Like, her academic record was mediocre. The president of UPenn had published far more papers. Not just quantity, but quality. And it's like, how was she elevated to this position? Again, of America's top university, the first university in America? It was insane. And so that was, again, I'm not saying that they accomplished some monumental feat in completely obliterating DEI as we know it. It's in every institution of the federal government, it's in every institution. It is the federal government. It is corporate America. It's pervasive. But that was significant because academia is, the fact that DEI is rooted in academia, where America's children and young professionals are going, or like young adults are going to be educated. That's our future class of.
So I want to pause you and develop the observation about academia, that there's also a very just frankly vile integration of academia and journalism that has that is historically weird. Journalism used to be a blue collar endeavor, and some of the best reporting still is, and as opposed to this fancy, slick intellectual thing, you know, that gets you invited to cocktail parties.
I saw from the New York Post, I can't resist saying this. The New York Post actually had this earlier and contacted Harvard earlier about Claudine Gay's plagiarism, but we were sent an incredible number of bullying emails from Harvard's lawyers threatening to sue us. So we were still doing our back and forth before we published. So, and I feel like the New York Post to me is the blue collar journalism outlet of America. But
Absolutely.
And the optics of that were so bad. I mean, to threaten legal action against America's blue collar publication, are you kidding me? It's like, what are,
Well,
then you're hiding something.
They're right wing, so they're not strictly speaking people. So that's okay.
Second class citizens, right? No.
Well, and of course, the intelligence community worked for the Democratic Party to discredit the Joe Biden laptop story, which the New York Post had. Just a remarkable attack upon journalism from, from a political party, from elements within the government. Just an extraordinary amount of insider corruption there against, the efforts just to tell the truth.
And the media, NPR said, we're not reporting on this because it's Russian disinformation from the New York Post. And,
So
When the Hunter Biden story happened, not only could you not tweet the link, you could not send the link in a direct message to anyone else on Twitter. That is how dangerous this disinformation was. And I hope we'll talk a little bit about the notion of disinformation.
I lost
today.
a foot when I read that story because I clicked on that link. So yeah, no, we're totally going to get to disinformation. So I do want to push on this distinction between journalism and activism, though, because when we look at the left and establishment institutions of journalism, the activism is so clear. We spot it immediately, and we kind of intrinsically or instinctually recoil from labeling this journalism. We want journalism to be something a little bit more hallowed and civically responsible than what we're seeing. So one example is, what does the New York Times do to defend Claudine Gay? Well, they trot out a bunch of high-ranking academics to say, well, there's plagiarism and then there's plagiarism.
Redefining it.
And they split the finest of hairs in order to defend one of their own, and really, and it just it's noxious. But if I were a man of the left, which arguably there aren't too many men on the left. So it might take some imagination. If I were a man of the left, I would look at someone like Chris Rufo and think, he's not a journalist. He's just an activist. And who's using things that kind of look formally like journalism to push a political agenda. So is the question of whether this is journalism or activism, is this a false dichotomy entirely? Or is there a way that journalism can remain itself while pursuing political ends without crossing this line into being mere activism?
One thing I think is difficult when you're dealing with a complex story is just trying to do justice to the truth of it. So that is, when there is a story that maybe cuts against some of your preconceptions and you're trying to write it up, that's where I think journalism really moves away from activism. There are also just things that people feel very clearly about and are pretty cut and dried. So there may be, it tends to converge. I don't think that. Rufo's an exceptional character only in his great success, and also the fact that he kind of tilts against the established powers, but there are many journalists who are no less kind of single-minded, or kind of even have a kind of militant mentality, but they're writing for mainstream papers. I mean, so I don't see. I think all the kind of heavy breathing about Chris Rufo is mostly just from people who don't like the information he's bringing to light.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's a strong distinction between his work and that, like any established papers that are very definitely meant to discredit certain people, certain institutions that have like a clear kind of near-term political goal that are coming out of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, every single week or day. So I don't.
Yeah.
I'll chime in. So I would say if you consider yourself an old school journalist, maybe it's doing a disservice to your work if you just kind of let it be. It's almost like you let it sit and just, that's it. Like, okay, I produced this work, consume it, read it, let it sway you, whatever it is, let it inform you. But what Rufo does is he follows up. So, honestly, his goal is to get scalps, make heads roll. That's his goal. But he's not going to do that through like malicious or kind of conniving means that are not based in truth. He's doing it based in truth, like unearthing real things that are happening and then applying pressure to people who hold power. And yeah, that's different than I'd say what maybe a person sitting at a typewriter or kind of the classic journalists once did. But I'll use a recent example from my reporting. So I spoke to two psychologists, clinical psychologists who work in the Veterans Administration, who were retaliated against and ostracized basically by the Biden administration because they publicly spoke out against gender ideology, which has fully infiltrated the VA. And I had a personal stake in this because my father was a Vietnam veteran, and he got care from the VA, and DEI and gender ideology are very, very much in the VA, which is, out of all the agencies in the federal government, that's the one where I was really hoping that it would infect last and the least, but no, not true. And they told me all kinds of disturbing stuff about what they're not only pushing on veterans, many of them come back with PTSD, but also that they're allowing men into women's medical spaces in the name of gender inclusion in the VA. And so I reported this, and I did the tweet thread, made sure to amplify it properly, but I wasn't going to let that sit. Like that's not the end of that story. I followed up with the Committee on Veterans Affairs. I talked to Congressman Rosendale. Like my goal is to take this to the end, like to expose every single incident like this and more until hopefully gender ideology and DEI at the VA are significantly undermined, or like they don't, maybe there isn't as much, like that would be my goal. And I think that still makes me a journalist, especially if all of the incidents I'm reporting are real. But I know that's much more like on the offense and aggressive than what journalism is normally associated with. But I think that is what is distinct about Rufo, is he's actually trying to get results at the end of the journalism journey.
Though historically there have been, at a time when America as a whole was more conservative, there were left-wing publications which had that same sort of policy-directed, goal-directed journalism as well. And at the time, they generally were respected by progressive outlets, and conservatives were more critical of them. And now the shoe is on the other foot, and it's the progressives, the left, which controls the most prestigious institutions, whether it's Harvard or the mainstream media, and which says, aha, well, if you're not adhering to our rule book, our code of journalistic ethics, then you're a bad journalist. Even if, in fact, you're the one who's bringing out facts that are important to the public, and they are the ones who are catering to power and are suppressing stories. So journalism is not necessarily a sanitary field. And I would say that there is a borderline between journalism and activism, but one has to be careful, in terms of drawing that border so rigorously that you wind up excluding information that actually is needed by the public. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he talks about the role of journalism in democracy in America, he says that journalism plays an important function in terms of organizing the interests and the local community identities of America's small towns and regions. And that was also a very partisan kind of press back in the day. And that too is journalism, even if it doesn't have all of the politeness or impression of objectivity that journalism perhaps in the mid-20th century had. You can have journalism that is objective, but you can also have journalism that is directed towards a policy aim or pushing a viewpoint. Opinion journalism is real journalism, and frankly, even partisan journalism can be real journalism.
So how did each of you get your start in journalism? How did that happen? And why would you want to do this horrible profession?
Okay, I'll start. Let's see. So I've only been in this for 3 years, so that's why I said, like, disclaimer. I'm still kind of, learning the ropes, so to speak, but I've learned a lot in 3 years. You can learn a lot. And there's also plenty of journalists out there that aren't associated with any official magazine or publication. They're completely independent on Substack, or, you could even argue Libs of TikTok is a journalist. Kaya, right, Jake? Just for what she publicizes on Twitter. But I basically studied economics at poli-sci in college, graduated in 2020, it was COVID, a lot of disruption, all the kids were sent home, I didn't get a proper graduation ceremony, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna work in finance, because that was what I majored in, and finance is secure right now, and I need to give my parents some ROI on their investment here. So I worked I worked in finance for a year, but it was 2020, so really fraught times, right? It was the racial justice riots, it was the 2020 election, it was COVID, it was this perfect storm of just political distractions. I could not, for the life of me, and throwback, I had interned for the Heritage Foundation in college. I grew up very, very motivated, like energized by politics as my parents, but just generally, it always kind of got me up in the morning, even when I hadn't done it for work. And so the finance thing was kind of a detour, but I was drawn back into it because of the confluence of those crazy events, and that was just always where my heart was. And so basically I got in on the ground floor at National Review because connections are important. This is where the connection really happens. I tell people I basically got into the mailroom, because I kind of did, because it was like a news writer role, which is sort of basic news aggregation, 300 words, 500 words, just, talk about like wire reporting, what AP and Reuters maybe once did. That's essentially what it was, just, kind of replicating what was already out there, done by left-wing original reporting. So whatever the New York Times, the Washington Post had done, you just repeat that. And it was just kind of basic, but I got in the door because the editor at the time, he's one of our more libertarian leading guys now, Charlie Cook. Well, he's always been that way. But back when I was at the Heritage Foundation, I was an intern, and they used to do this annual debate against the Cato Institute, which I feel like now this debate, the libertarian versus conservatism debate, is almost like not irrelevant, but nobody cares anymore. It's like almost like a moot debate. Now it's an intra-right debate, populism versus, old school, whatever. And he was the moderator of that debate. And I basically kept that connection for a number of years until it came time to me to apply to NR, and then he vouched for me and my performance in that debate. I got into NR, been there ever since, and basically it just kind of moved up slowly, renegotiated titles and beats and all that jazz, and now I'm doing culture war reporting and trying to implement more of Rufo's style because I think it's more effective, and I think it actually is good for the business model of NR. I think it will generate traffic that's important, and subscriptions. I think one of the things that Rufo can do is he can retain donors because they do see as what he's doing is effective. So it's good business to do what he's doing because donors don't feel like they're putting their like their charitable contributions into an empty vessel that is just like a no-name nonprofit. They feel like they're actually going to get something for their investment. So that's.
So let's move on to Dan.
Yeah, I would say that many folks will find that they simply have a compulsion to become journalists or to become writers, and that was probably my case. Even in high school, I was I was a student of Latin already in high school, and we had for some reason we put together a newsletter for the Latin class, and I ran that, and I don't know why, but I did. So I've always enjoyed writing. I've always felt like if there's something worth saying, I should try to say it well in writing, and I'm also interested to learn answers to questions, whether it's about public policy or economics or other things that may not be adequately answered. And when I read a text, I can be critical and say to myself, well, it's curious that we're not hearing this other side to the story, or it's curious that something is being assumed here which actually is not a safe assumption. So all of that got me interested in journalism. And when I was undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis, I wanted to write for whatever publications were available. I found that there wasn't a publication that seemed really interesting or exciting. Certainly the establishment student paper wasn't that, and the sort of smaller things were also, there was one that was just a dull sort of quasi-scholarly political science journal, and I said, no, this is inadequate. I want to start my own publication. And a number of conservative organizations helped provide a little bit of training and guidance, a little bit of financing for it. Collegiate Network did. The Leadership Institute also had a journalism school at that point. But it was really a matter of, because I had this compulsion, I had this, sort of self-organizing, directed tendency. And so, I got together with some friends and we created a campus conservative publication at Washington University. And I enjoyed doing that. And it was my calling. I had found it. And I knew that I wanted to go and work for, a magazine. At the time, interestingly enough, the American Conservative hadn't existed yet. Then it came into existence, sort of towards the end of my undergraduate years, and I had an opportunity to go work for that. I started out as a reporter actually for them, again very soon after the launch of the magazine, and that has been sort of my entree into doing more and more. And I've continued to do journalism again as a columnist, as a mostly an opinion writer, but occasionally doing forays and interviews and other things. But I've also had this institutional role of promoting journalism in other outlets through, fellowships that I'm able to give people, and through support for campus journalists. And that makes me, feel good that I'm both able to do things as a journalist myself, but also to encourage other people to greater heights, including Matthew Schmitz. Matthew was a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow at a time when I just had started administering that program, so we were delighted that to have such a talented young person.
Yeah, I got my start in journalism just writing for the campus conservative paper at my college, which was a Collegiate Network paper. So the Collegiate Network and ISI more generally were really important for me starting my career, and so there's a certain symmetry at this moment that I'm here at an event co-sponsored by ISI. I'm grateful for you, Dan, and for Johnny Burtka, the president of ISI, for this event and also for the support I've enjoyed throughout my career from ISI at crucial moments. So I worked for the campus paper, and then after college, I was interested in journalism. I was interested in politics. Had a chance to go work on a campaign. Instead, decided I would do journalism. Stayed in it, and here I am.
Great. So I'm going to circle back to something that Carolyn said a moment ago about news aggregation and writing, these short, news summaries, of the original reportage. AI is potentially going to take away those jobs. The job that was your foot in the door at NR. And it's obvious why it's going to happen. It's radically cheaper. Magazines and newspapers are often working with shoestring budgets, and this is like an obvious thing to do. It's probably inevitable. It doesn't mean it's ethical. what do you see the consequences of this being, and with the potential disappearance of kind of entry-level roles, what does the pipeline into journalism going to look like in the very near future?
No, I don't
No,
know.
this is, there's probably no good answer to
No,
this
I
question,
really,
so
like,
it's for everybody.
I mean, I know a publisher of a magazine that absolutely confessed to me that he's going to implement it very soon, and it won't take everybody's jobs. It will hopefully complement some jobs, which I think we probably hear that a lot. It'll complement your job. I don't know. The senior writers and editors will probably be helped by this, but yeah, I'm not so sure about the junior level people. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. So if you get a scoop, or well, no, you said it's okay. So aggregation, you're right. It's just like recirculating, information that's already out there. But I mean, I think original journalism will still be needed. Breaking stories, that will still be needed, and you don't have to be like a genius or an expert to do that. You could be young, like me, and just start breaking stories. Like talking to people on the phone, getting on interviews, and breaking stories. I don't think AI can replicate that, the investigative component. But yeah, maybe aggregation, sure, and maybe that is just technology moving quickly. So, I mean, I guess if it's accurate, then it's ethical in that sense. But I don't know how to treat, the taking people's jobs part.
Well, I would agree with what has just been said. A lot of those aggregation jobs are themselves quite new. They did not exist. You can say there were analogs, perhaps, to traditional magazines and newspapers, but it actually was quite different. You weren't just taking links and putting them together, and the amount of rewriting of things that had previously been published. It was a different environment. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it was quite distinct from what aggregation is on the internet. So the internet created something, and now the internet's going to destroy it. I think Carolyn is exactly right, however, that I'm not impressed in the least by anything that I've read an AI compose. In fact, so the internet has made journalism, has made entry-level journalism much easier. It used to be that in the past 10, 15 years, people could do very poor journalism, but they could still get published, get a byline, because they were writing for some website. That's going to be, affected by AI. But frankly, that was bad journalism or pretty low-level journalism to begin with. So I agree with Caroline that the value-added material, actually picking up a phone and talking to anyone, no millennial or Generation Z does that anyway. So that already is something that would put you miles above, any of your peers. I think that the real danger with AI...
I just want to say that is so true.
Yeah.
If you are capable, just internally, morally, of picking up a phone or going, and calling someone, that will give you a huge advantage.
People have no idea. And, I was less...
So many people will never ever do it.
Yeah, if you're
They're
not afraid of
unwilling.
confrontation, and you want to start on the ground reporting, you will be ahead of everyone your age, because I'm terrified by doing this sometimes, but or even going to meet them in person. That'll set you apart, because you're gonna.
It really is true, and it's something that it's very hard to get young journalists. I run a program for student journalists, and it requires a lot of browbeating to get them to actually do the traditional work of journalism. So that is still extremely valuable. Very few people want to do it. It requires, you don't necessarily have to be an outgoing personality. In fact, I've been kind of astonished by certain people who are very socially maladroit, but who nonetheless are very good interviewers and reporters. And it's just because they're channeled or focused in a particular way that actually makes them very effective when they're doing their job, but they can't have a casual conversation. What I do fear about AI is the signal to noise ratio. That basically, if AI is able to flood the internet with a multiple in terms of content, right now I find, for example, Google is less and less useful. I try to find facts about things that have happened, and I get iterations, dozens of iterations on the first set of returns that are just rewrites of the same story by AI or by very low-level journalists. and nobody is, even providing the most basic additional new facts in, 20 different stories on the same topic. It's great to have 20 different stories on the same topic if they're actually different, if they actually, each one provides some new fact. But if they're all just, versions of the same, exactly the same set of facts, just juggled in a different pattern, that can clog up the, search engines. It clogs up, everything, and it becomes very difficult to get actually good journalism into circulation and overcome that noise barrier.
So I want to move on to next question.
Can I say quickly, as an editor, even just working in Microsoft Word, the grammar suggestions it gives me, because I feel like, people are, okay, well, reporters are going to, but editors, AI is going to take over. No. I say this as, a grammar Nazi pedant, but no, all of AI suggestions are terrible. They know nothing about English grammar.
But I should add though that
taste.
but think about how politicized those corrections are.
Yeah,
And there's a generation of young people. I mean, I'm Generation X, so I'm just shocked by all of this crazy gender neutral language nonsense. But young people have been brought up their whole lives by that, and every time Microsoft Word or another program is automatically correcting them, they're internalizing that, and that's becoming normal to them. They're becoming habituated to it. That's an extremely corrupting thing. And of course, if you think about the impact this has on journalism, how can you how can you have journalism if you can't report, a man did this as opposed to a woman did this? If it's all they. You don't even know how many people were involved, let alone whether you're talking about men or women. So it's mind-boggling how damaging that can be.
Okay, so young people already don't even know grammar to begin with, and then we're doing this to them. So it's dark. So as an editor, Dan, what are signs of a good journalist? When somebody gives you a pitch and you're not immediately familiar with them, they haven't been referred to you, just in that pitch, what are red flags, what are green flags?
In some respects, the most striking red flags are the things that come after a pitch. Sometimes they're even included in the pitch. So if somebody pitches a story, an article they'd like to write, or maybe they've already written it, and they say, they give an indication that they've offered this to several other outlets simultaneously, or for that matter, that they want to, offer it somewhere else, in the very near future. That's, a red flag. There's, I have plenty of writers. I don't need someone who is, trying to game the system and thinks that they can, play editors off one another. And this happens at every level in journalism. It's fine. I understand where a writer's coming from, especially a freelancer. You want to get your material published. You want to get it out there quickly. You want to get paid. But just make sure that you form a relationship with an editor where you never get in a situation where the editor is now going to publish your article and it turns out it's already been published somewhere else, and you've completely screwed up that editor's, entire work process.
Amen.
I will also say an important thing that comes after the pitching process is the ability to take rejection well. So, you will get turned down. Don't be deterred. Don't get angry. Keep in mind, it's easy. All writers are sensitive. And so whenever they get rejected, they feel like this is a personal rejection. They've been turned down for a date. They're total social pariahs. That's how they feel. They get angry at the editor. It's a very emotionally intense thing. But keep in mind that the editor on the other side of this has the same kind of crap to deal with. Because you're constantly dealing with these hypersensitive writers. They're concerned about their language. They're concerned about whether you're accepting their articles quickly enough. And I know as a writer that I can be a pain to editors. So if you're aware of the pressures that are on editors, you can be better at pitching, because you're then in a position to be patient with them, to realize that their time is precious. That be gentle. You can nudge them. You can reach out and say, "Oh, I just wanted to check on this article that I'd sent a week or so ago or whatever." Gentleness works. The other thing is just reliability, and there's sort of two sides to this. If you're someone who always gets the story in on time and to the specified word count, you don't have to be as good as a lot of other people, because you're at least reliable, and an editor knows if I have a content hole that needs to be filled, this person will do it. It's going to come in on time. It's going to be at length. I don't have to worry about it. There are other people who are the flip side of that. If you are bad with deadlines, if you are bad with staying at length, you'd better be really talented. And that can work. I'm happy to publish lots of people who are always late and have lots of problems, but their work is actually brilliant enough that it justifies that. But don't count on that. You should really try to build the good habits of writing to length and writing on time so that editors will on you. And if you can actually be both really, really good and talented and also on time and at length and pleasant to deal with when you're when editors reach out to you, that will get you in almost every time. It's really that combination of traits is golden.
All right. So, how are professional publications changing and evolving right now because of Substack? Particularly your publications. What are the challenges of having actually, very serious, quality, independent journalism, and just a surfeit of garbage journalism as well that just kind of clogs everything up. How are you navigating that right now?
Yeah, I mean, Substack has been such a huge phenomenon. I think it's done a lot of good. It does make it harder, in my experience, to corral a high-profile writer because they have their own thing. They need to feed the beast. They have an audience to serve. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. I think most of the people who are big on Substack that I know of have established reputations separately from Substack.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe sometimes through academia or frequently through more conventional journalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think going forward, probably a question for Substack and something like that will be, if these more conventional journalistic institutions are weakened,
Mm-hmm.
can Substack itself produce the kinds of writers that have made Substack successful? I will say that almost every magazine, certainly every magazine represented on this panel, has a really distinct purpose from something like Substack. It's actually drawing together a group of people for an important and specific purpose, and the meaning of the endeavor comes from the variety of people who are in and then the people who are out. So there's always a kind of curation, and that lends a magazine a certain special meaning. I've been told, the late Midge Decter, very distinguished journalist, she said, if you want to make an argument, write a book. If you want to start a movement, start a magazine, right? So National Review is, quintessential movement magazine. Modern Age really kind of preceded it and kind of forming the conservative movement. So I think that there's going to be a very strong purpose for magazines, in that way, when people want to kind of create a certain kind of conversation, or they're going to start magazines, and when people want to enjoy a certain kind of conversation, they're probably often going to read them.
I agree with that, although I do think not just Substack, but a number of developments in the internet era have led to a disaggregation. You can follow your favorite writer on Substack or on any number of different publications. I think the number of people who actually go to a magazine's homepage and look at the overall selection of stories for the internet is dropping and steadily declining. Instead, people are following individual authors or individual stories that they want to follow. And that is, it is a change that is going to be a major adjustment, I think, for all of us, because that kind of curated dinner party, which used to be characteristic of magazines, it still is characteristic of magazines, but it's much harder to do that now because the readers themselves would prefer to create their own dinner party out of their own sources through aggregation.
Also, just wanted to add, just speaking as a lowly writer, I think it's helpful to have an editor. And if you're writing a Substack, maybe you are not used to getting edited. It's important to be have a proofreader, second or third or fourth set of eyes. So I think there's no replacement for a really good editor, especially if you are starting at the ground level as a recent college grad. To just have your work literally ripped into shreds is a really important learning experience that you may not get if you're just launching a Substack right off the bat. So yeah, it's important to have criticism, and that helps refine your talent and storytelling abilities, your prose, all of that. So
That's absolutely true. I noticed, those people who came up through print journalism have an understanding that, you need to be concise in your language, whereas people who've done web journalism, oftentimes, even if they've had editors, the editors have not been strict enough. And so you get this very flabby kind of writing, unnecessary adverbs and adjectives, and it's dismaying to those of us who were brought up on a certain austere set of older standards.
Everybody needs an editor. Obviously, I'm biased in saying that, but even, I know older writers, some experience who have their own Substacks, they don't have an editor. And again, even when I write, and I'm an editor, I need an editor. Everybody needs another set of eyes. And I have to say, being the editor of a tabloid newspaper, Dan's advice on, not having flabby writing, and of course Caroline's on getting an editor, right on target.
So, starting to run out of time, so I'm going to do 2 more questions. First one's weird. So, you or one of your writers experiences an honest-to-God miracle. How do you report on that? How do you publish on that? What evidentiary standards do you use? Assuming that you're publishing to a mixed audience of believers and unbelievers.
hilarious. I love the thought experiment now. Just thinking about this.
If Chris Rufo experienced a miracle, how would it be?
I know. I swear, I'm not stumping for Chris Rufo, but I will say I was
but it's a real question.
was slightly radicalized by this fellowship because I was like,
Isn't
oh.
Chris Rufo kind of a miracle?
Totally.
So,
Okay, all right. Let me think. Yeah, like a religious, like a bizarre natural occurrence that cannot be explained.
the leg I lost to COVID grows back in front of you. How do you report on that?
Okay. Well, I suppose. Okay, reporter hat on. Talk to you first. Figure out what the story is, what you are claiming happened, and then request photographic evidence of the before and after. Corroborate the photos, if possible, through secondary sources. Honestly, until I wouldn't report it unless I could basically achieve all of these number of benchmarks of verifying. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't report on it unless say you were a crank, and you were I don't know, say I found drugs in your apartment or something. Well, actually, if your leg grew back, it's obvious to the observable. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying to. How do I report on a miracle that is literally everyone can see? Well, but maybe people didn't know that you lost your leg. Okay.
So I think my response would be: is it newsworthy? My upbringing, miracles happen in people's lives all the time, and you would maybe talk about it, during kind of, a church when people are giving prayer requests, or you tell your kind of friends about it in your Bible study. But miracles happen all the time. If you talk to the people experiencing them, they happen all the time. So mostly it just isn't news. Miracles aren't news in America because miracles are happening every day to Americans. If it's something really strange or that could be newsworthy, if I get a pitch and it's hi, Richard Dawkins here. I just had miraculous healing. I mean, so for that, the personal essay is instantly the form I would go to. But again, it would not because there would be a real kind of drama there and an interest and a sort of surprise to it. But if it were, my youth pastor saying, there was a miracle, I'd say, the sun rose today. It's not newsworthy. You experienced a miracle. People in the church do all the time, so we're not going to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just concur in all of that. You can present the story in different kinds of genres. If you want to do an investigative piece, you would have to do exactly what Caroline had recommended. See what evidence there was. Did this person really lose a leg? What do they really have a real leg now? Is it not a prosthetic? Talk to medical scientists. Talk to some priests or others as to do you think this would be a kind of miracle that might happen? But as Matthew said, in other contexts where someone has personally perhaps they've seen a statue that they own weeping or something like that, and it can't be verified scientifically. The question is there still an interesting story that this person can tell on their own credibility, which the reader can then either accept or reject. But here's a story, here's a testimonial, lots of things in our lives we cannot fully confirm, but we can at least say, do I think this is a trustworthy, morally serious person telling me in a personal essay about something that he or she has experienced.
All right. Okay, so last question, then we're going to turn it over to the audience. If the Gestapo tomorrow drags you out of your home off to the Rainbow Gulag for re-education or to grind your bones into glitter for the next Pride Parade, what single piece that you've published, either as a writer or an editor, would you most want to represent your legacy in the public square?
My expose of the Trevor Project, which is a gargantuan organization claiming to represent trans kids and kids who identify as LGBT. And this story I did, I think it was like 2 years ago, basically I uncovered that there's a chat room that the Trevor, and this is not like a joke institution either. I mean, so many celebrities from like Daniel Radcliffe, so many others have affiliations with the Trevor Project. You might remember Sam Brinton, the nuclear official in the Biden administration, who was also a kleptomaniac. He had a pretty prestigious role at the Trevor Project, so it's kind of like a feeder for, honestly, just LGBT ideologues. But I think it's particularly nefarious because it is specifically targeting kids, and the idea of a trans kid generally, which I don't believe that exists, and it doesn't exist. So what I found was that there's a chat room that the Trevor Project hosts called Trevor Space, and basically adults were priming minors into seeking gender transition without their parents' knowledge or consent, and that's like a pretty common story that we hear now. But at the time, it was there in broad daylight. Basically, messages. Here's a website you can go to order binders. Here's information about hormone injections, about bottom top surgery, and it's just like 20-something-year-olds, or not 20-something-year-olds, but adults. They were adults speaking to children, and the Trevor Project was allowing them to mix, in this setting, and there was really perverse sexual content on there that would shock you. I mean, like words you've never heard of before, that Urban Dictionary, like the depths of Urban Dictionary couldn't begin to explain. I mean, all kinds of fetishes and beyond, just absolute degeneracy. And children are ostensibly going to this place because they're experiencing gender confusion and they're hoping for mentorship, and instead they're being led down a rabbit hole from which there is no return. So given the context of your question being the Rainbow Gestapo, I think that plays into the theme pretty well, and I think that's kind of my end hurrah. Like, you guys are pedophiles, yay! Like, basically, yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I mean, they wouldn't take the accusation. It's not like it would help. It would hurt them, but I don't know. Some people might go see me going down and be like, oh, okay, well, yeah.
And some people might keep their kids away from them, which would be
maybe. Hopefully. Yeah, it's the one piece I can think of that is directly related to what you just laid out. So yeah.
Caroline's answer is terrific. I will give a more evasive answer. I always completely forget, kind of what my own even personal favorites are when asked a question like this. And one thing I would perhaps say about that is I'm quite comfortable having a readership whose values or whose personal, favorite works of mine might be different from my own. So some of my own favorite works that I've written, might be cultural items, not even politically cultural items, but just items about, films or philosophy or other things, which, would not necessarily or almost certainly would not be the most significant work that I've done, but nevertheless are things that I personally enjoy more. So if there's a difference between readers' evaluation and my evaluation, I'm comfortable with that as both a writer and also as an editor. One of the things I try to keep in mind with every publication I've been in charge of, whether it's the American Conservative or Modern Age or other things, is what I like as an editor isn't always necessarily the same as what my readers are interested in. And you want to strike a balance, because you do want to challenge your readers. You do want to give your readers some things that they might not like, but that you think are worthy and of their attention. But you also don't want to, just disregard your own readership. You also want, them to have, what they are paying, to buy your magazine to get. And so I don't feel terribly conflicted about, the idea that some pieces are for readers whose tastes or whose interests are different from mine, and other things are, dear to me, but may not be exactly what the mass public is looking for.
Yeah, for me, it's a piece I wrote for the American Conservative in 2021, The Meaning of Harvey Weinstein, just looking at some of the kind of due process issues around that case. There's a lot of kind of inculpatory journalism. There's been a lot of kind of journalistic promotion of contempt for due process, and I feel it's important to push back against that. And it's fun to it's always fun to indict people, but it's also fun to kind of argue for them, even if only on kind of due process grounds. So that's what I enjoy.
If you haven't read this piece, you absolutely need to. It's I think it's actually a really good example of perfectly non-ideological journalism that simply here's truth that needs to be told, that is not convenient for anyone on either side of the aisle, that nobody wants you to say, and yet must be said. And yeah, so that's where we're going to leave things. I'm going to open it up to the room. Jacob.
So my question is, who do you think on the right would make an excellent New York Times columnist and currently is not a New York Times columnist?
Well, we just all nominate ourselves, or nominate one another. I mean, not ourselves, but Matthew Schmitz would be terrific.
The idea of ourselves is we're great stuff for the New York Times. They get him because he.
Well, Matthew's written wonderful stuff there as well. So.
Is that a loaded question? Is that basically like for us to point out who in our midst?
My advice hasn't been taken, but I have suggested two names to people I know at the Times in the past, and that's Dan McCarthy and Helen Andrews.
Okay.
Thank you.
For a second, I thought it was like a question was like, out the person at your magazine who's secretly.
Oh,
no,
that would be a fun question.
I
too.
thought that's what it was. I thought it was like out the lib,
Who has
basically.
the soul of David French at your
Pretty
magazine?
much. That's what I thought the question was, but it's not.
But let me say this though.
Michael Brett and Doherty. That's all I'm saying.
Doherty would be great.
Yeah.
But you have to keep in mind, the price you pay for having those kinds of outlets. So one of the things that's very admirable about Ross is that he has not, sold his soul to be a New York Times columnist. But people are often, Ross gets a lot of flack from the right of people saying, oh, you're not nearly tough enough, you're not nearly, going far enough on any range of issues. He actually goes much farther than is totally safe at the New York Times. And, I think that's admirable. There are a lot of writers that, I think all three of us like, but if they had a perch in the New York Times, they wouldn't be allowed to do the kind of work we like them for. And, I've certainly felt this occasionally when I've written for mainstream outlets. It's very interesting, by the way. I mean, I referred to the language police earlier, but on these gender issues, I wrote a piece. Won't mention which sort of national outlet this was for, mainstream outlet, but I was discussing a presidential candidate who had I forget. I think he vetoed a bill that had some relation to sex change operations or gender reassignment operations. This mainstream publication would not allow that word to appear. You could not say gender reassignment. You could not say sex change. They insisted gender affirmation, which, wow. I mean, you can't be a conservative, well, I don't think you can be a conservative writer and, truckle to that kind of demand. Now, I was able to get around this because what I did is I went to the actual bill that the guy had signed or vetoed, and I quoted the language verbatim. So it was in quote marks. You can't argue with that. So that's an instance of journalistic ethical rules or fact-checking rules playing to our advantage. But when you have those kinds of biases against conservatives, it's not necessarily a good idea to send conservatives there. The other thing too, this is playing a little bit against some of the interests of various programs I've been involved in. But oftentimes conservatives want to get their best reporters. Oh, let's send our best reporter to the New York Times. Let's send our best reporter to Politico. Let's send our best reporter to the Atlantic. Well, reporters don't get to choose their own stories. They don't get to write exactly what they want. They're at the beck and call, and their careers are determined by editors and by publishers. When you send your best reporters to a progressive outlet, just a mainstream outlet that has a liberal tilt, they are going to have to, for professional reasons, adhere to the biases of their institution. It is almost impossible to just keep your soul while you're at these institutions, and you will lose it by degrees. You will not even be aware of the compromises that you are making until you've made so many that you can never return. So again, I actually have a lot of respect for Ross because he has not kind of lost himself that way. And there's certain other columnists at the New York Times and elsewhere where I could say, oh, he's changed his views very quickly on a number of issues, and it seems like that's a comfortable new position to have if you are writing for the New York Times. And if you said what you were saying when you were writing for National Review, for example, you'd be in hot water right now or canceled altogether.
I'll just say I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. Edmonton, Alberta. Sorry.
Now, let's not speak ill of former Robert Novak Journalism Fellow program.
Yeah.
But I think Dan's right though. You probably would get neutered over at the New York Times if you were sent into the lion's den. So it's kind of a risk, maybe.
It is like it's not quite. I mean, you don't want to compare yourself to someone in East Germany, but it is a matter of you have to write the truth, but without alerting the authorities to just what you're saying. So you do have to practice esoteric writing and be very Straussian about the whole thing.
And by that point, nobody gets what you're saying. So
That's
might as well give up.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do another question. Surely we have another question.
I've got another one.
I'll ask a
Claire.
question. What do you think about the difference? Because say I like writing, I enjoy putting words together and things like that. How does that add up to journalism? Because sometimes I read some pieces and I'm like, this is just somebody who has an opinion that they want to get out into the public square. So they write this. It's not super interesting. And then you have people who are just like frolicking in their words, Like, is there a balance? Do you think people who are journalists should also enjoy writing? Or the people who kind of use it as a tool? I don't know, it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know, it's interesting. Balance.
I say like both. I don't write opinion, and I do think shameless plug for reporting on the right. I think there's probably a shortage of that, and I think there's it's oversaturated. The opinion side is oversaturated. I think. I mean, not in like a bad way. I think the people. I mean, everyone on this panel and all the people I write with, brilliant people, and I'm so glad they're the ones writing the opinion, and I'm so glad I'm not. That's what I'm saying. But I do think there's a niche for reporting. And it needs to be filled because it's like there's just not enough of it. We're not breaking the news like the New York Times and the Washington Post are nearly as much. So we're kind of always playing against them, and it is unfortunate to be always in a secondary reactionary position where you're aggregating the Times, so the Washington Post. So yeah, I mean that's what I would say. It's I love doing that though. Like I love writing the words. And you can infuse your opinion if you work for a right-of-center journalistic outlet, and that's fun, I guess. But it's also, the end goal is also fun, which is. If you didn't enjoy it at all, you wouldn't do it.
That said, there are people who enjoy it, but they're not good at it, and they keep doing it anyway. So that's also a bad thing and needs to be discouraged. I think what Caroline said earlier about the importance of editors comes into play here. So a good editor will tell you whether you are simply entertaining yourself with your writing or whether you're actually doing something that's of value, not just to that editor, but to the public. Which, you know, a good editor is, again, someone who's aware of his publication's readership or of the general media environment and is in a position to make sure that, you know, what a writer is doing is actually, you know, objectively good, worthwhile work and not simply playing to that particular writer's personal fancies.
I also think reported opinion is something that's kind of underrated that people don't think about a lot. People think there's reporting and there's opinion. But, you know, I'm an editor, but the writing I do tends to be reported opinion. You know, I went to Ukraine for, you know, I was in Ukraine nearly a month last year, and I wrote pieces. Now, they were reported opinion pieces, and I had a lot of voices. I obviously had an opinion I was getting across, but I used reporting to buck up my points. And I think this is something that's kind of, you know, underrated. And I always encourage, when I talk to young journalists, to not be afraid of talking to people, to calling people, as Dan says, or at least emailing, to talking to sources. Because I think opinion that's reported is the strongest stuff that, you know, and I've had opinion pieces in the New York Post break stories. You know, like Jim Bovard is someone who writes for me a lot, a mutual friend of Dan and I's, I would say. Certainly, you know, Jim's a big fan of Dan's. And he often will break stories in his opinion pieces because he will look at stuff that the government is doing that, of course, the mainstream media, who loves this administration, is not looking at. You know, so he, for example, did a really good piece reporting last year on the Biden administration, you know, using, you know, financial data. So, you know, Treasury would do a, you know, this is like, you know, a red flag. Someone shopped at Base Pro Shops. And literally this was triggering, you might be a violent lone wolf domestic terrorist, right? So nobody else had noticed this, but Jim didn't, and did an opinion piece, but with original reporting. And so, you know, I think that was a great question, and I think there is you know, a great space for reporting. I think opinion's important, but I think also it's underrated, reported opinion. You know, doing some of your own legwork to communicate something and then bringing your opinion about what it means, what it is.
I'll add a little footnote to that because there's an asymmetry. A lot of very good reporting done by the right is considered by the establishment, the liberal mainstream, to be reported opinion. Whereas in fact, a lot of what the liberal mainstream itself thinks of as being purely objective reporting is in fact reported opinion. If the opinions that are in your article happen to align with the establishment, they won't even be detected as opinion. They'll simply be considered, oh, of course, everyone, you know, has this view on the environment or this view on gender. You know.
So I want to close this out by building off of Claire's question, kind of inverting it. So I had a conversation with, you know, First Things fearless leader Rusty Reno recently about how when you have to write a lot, you kind of get pushed towards workmanlike prose. And you know, what a lot of us who write got into writing for us was we love the written word, we love beautiful sentences, we love the sound of language, we have a feel for poetics. But you know, if you want to make a living at this, you kind of have to kill that and murder that little part of your soul if you're going to be able to produce the amount of content that you need to make a living. And so how do you do that? What's in your own practice? How do you get the content written without losing that entirely?
So the first rule of style is to have something to say. It's really important. I think that kind of goes to Claire's question. A second ago, you just sort of, I don't know, spinning fine words is, you know, all very nice, but kind of style requires economy, and economy requires actually having something that you're trying to accomplish. So you have to have something to say. You know, for myself, you know, I just read things that aren't connected to my work. That's how I stay in touch with writing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are dangers to high volume writing, and one can just become, you know, a machine churning out words. But if you do, you know, suffer that fate, maybe the higher reaches of journalism were never for you in the first place. No, I don't mean to be totally brutal there, but if you're good, what you'll find is that you churn out a lot of words. You have to do a lot of writing early in your career that's not the writing you want to be doing, but it's the writing that your boss wants you to do. If you succeed in that and you become someone who's known as a good writer, good reporter, you're getting stories out there, then as you move up in your career, you have more luxury and leeway to follow the kind of style you want. So I would say, if you're good enough, you can strike that balance between, on the one hand, volume, and then once you've had enough volume, you can then start to exercise more of your own style and take more care in your work as you go on. And that's true, I think, of almost any field. I mean, certainly in the academy as well. Undergraduate papers are just busy work, but by the time you're someone who's not just a PhD, but whose work in a field is recognized as having real scholarly value, then in a previous world, at least a previous dispensation, you would then have more freedom to study as you wish and write as you wish. Today, of course, the political correctness that's imposed in the academy stifles that to an extraordinary degree, and that may wind up being true in journalism as well. Certainly, even just the ordinary journalism that I read, at various, either middle of the road or left-wing outlets, is it's just bad writing now because of the overwhelming. First of all, it's not just the language policing, but also the left now encourages the most simple-minded, C-spot run, kindergarten kind of telegraphing of progressive morality. And if you don't have that, even if you were a progressive but you were just subtle about it and didn't try to slap people in the face with it, you would be seen as suspect. Why is this person not so enthusiastically praising the emperor's new clothes? So I think progressive journalism is in a free fall. By the way, this is many of the best Substacks that I follow are by left-wing journalists who are unpublishable by any of the left-wing media. People like Zaid Jalani or Glenn Greenwald, they won't be published by progressive media because it's not that they are Trumpists or right-wingers, but they are honest and they speak from the heart and they have a sort of direct way with language, and that is extremely toxic in today's progressive media environment.
I would just say, in reporting, I think there's probably less risk of losing your creative spark because you're not writing poetry. But that being said, you have to capture people's attention. You have to hook them if you're doing this properly. And if you have an angle, and I mean, like I said, with the Veterans Administration and the gender ideology, yeah, it's in the headline. Like, my value system is completely conveyed in the headline. What I am trying to expose is coming from a particular point of view. And so, yeah, I have like an agenda, so to speak, but I still need to do storytelling. I can't have people bored, like, to tears. So I have to be, creative. And yeah, there's like an interesting project every time I'm writing something like that, because I have to make sure people make it to the end. And I have to pack a punch, so to speak. That doesn't mean like clickbait writing necessarily, but like there has to be a story arc. Who are the players? Who are the characters? What happens to them? And then a call to action at the end. So that's the kind of fun, I think, the creativity in reporting. But yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you.